I spent 32 years believing I was serving God, that every spreadsheet I filled out, every number I triple-checked before filing, and every financial report I prepared for the overseers was part of something sacred. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I am 59 years old, and for more than 3 decades, I worked in the accounting department of the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses in Warwick, New York. Before that, I spent 8 years in Brooklyn, in that massive complex they affectionately called Bethel, the House of God. I was one of the few who had access to the complete financial archives, the international bank accounts, and the donation reports coming in from every kingdom hall around the world. They trusted me because I was discreet, because I never questioned, and because I had demonstrated absolute loyalty since I was baptized at 27. But there is a moment in every man's life when the truth becomes too heavy to carry alone, when silence ceases to be a virtue and transforms into complicity. For me, that moment arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October, when I found a series of bank transfers that simply did not make sense within the narrative I had been taught my entire adult life. These were not small numbers. They were not donations destined for the preaching work or the construction of new kingdom halls as I had imagined. They were millions of dollars being moved into accounts that did not appear on any official report, to companies I had never heard of, for investments that contradicted everything they preached from the pulpit. I was raised to believe the organization was transparent, that the brothers' money was used solely to expand God's kingdom on earth. I was told we were different from the churches of Christendom, that we didn't have priests living in palaces while the flock went in want. But what I discovered in the depths of those digital archives made me question every sacrifice I made, every opportunity one refused, and every relationship I abandoned in the name of the truth. This is my story, and I need to tell it before it is too late, before age or the pressure of the organization silences me forever. What you are about to read are not conspiracy theories or the speculations of bitter apostates. These are documented facts, real numbers, and transactions that passed through my hands and remain etched on my conscience like scars that will never completely fade. Before diving into the darker details of this story, I need you to understand how I got here, why a man would dedicate more than 3 decades of his life to a religious organization, working without a salary, sleeping in shared rooms, eating in collective dining halls, and obeying rules stricter than those of any Catholic monastery. I was not born a Jehovah's Witness. I encountered the religion at 25, during a difficult period in my life, right after losing my job at an accounting firm in Chicago. My marriage of 3 years was crumbling because my wife could no longer stand my emotional distance and my long working hours. That was when 2 men in suits knocked on my door one Saturday morning, carrying worn Bibles and genuine smiles that seemed so rare in that cold, indifferent city. I began to study with them. I attended meetings at the Kingdom Hall, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of something bigger, of a global family that truly cared for one another. It wasn't manipulation, at least, not in the obvious, grotesque way people imagine. It was subtle, it was gradual, it was a series of small concessions we make when we are vulnerable and desperate to belong somewhere. I was baptized 2 years later at a regional convention that gathered thousands of people in a stadium in Illinois. When I emerged from that improvised pool, I felt I had left my old self behind and was born again as a servant of Jehovah. My ex-wife never understood. She thought I had gone crazy, that I was being controlled by a cult, but for me, it was liberation. Within 5 years, I was invited to serve at Bethel, to use my accounting skills at the organization's world headquarters. It was considered a rare privilege, an honor reserved only for the most dedicated. I accepted immediately, selling the little I had, donating half to the organization, and keeping the rest in an account I rarely touched. But now, after everything I have seen, after all the secrets I unearthed from those files protected by passwords that changed every 3 months, I need to share this story with whoever is willing to listen. If you are watching this now, if something in this story resonates with your own experience or with doubts you have kept buried deep in your conscience, leave a comment down below telling me which city you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story, because what I am going to reveal in the next few minutes will make you question everything you think you know about religious organizations and the power of money. Also, leave your like if you believe the truth must be exposed, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how many certainties it destroys in the process. I arrived at Bethel on a freezing morning in January of 1991, carrying an old suitcase and a heart full of expectations that today seem almost childish in their purity and naivety. The Brooklyn complex was immense, occupying several entire city blocks, with buildings that rose against the gray sky like monuments to faith, or to ambition, depending on how you looked at it. I was welcomed by a brother named Luther Simmons, a man in his early 60s who had worked at Bethel for almost 40 years, and who had that air of someone who has seen it all but still maintains a polite smile on his face. He showed me the room I would share with 3 other brothers, all too young to understand that privilege and sacrifice are just 2 different names for the same thing. In the first few months, I worked in the donation reception department, a simple job of logging checks and cash that arrived by mail from every corner of the United States and the world. It was impressive to see the quantity of envelopes that arrived daily. Some contained crumpled $5 bills sent by elderly brothers who clearly lived on minimum pensions. Others held checks of substantial value signed by families who had sold properties or received inheritances and decided to donate everything to the organization. Each envelope came accompanied by handwritten letters, some shaky with age, others firm and full of conviction, all expressing love for Jehovah and gratitude for the spiritual food they received. After 2 years of demonstrating competence and absolute discretion, I was promoted to the General Accounting Department, where the real work of organizing that immense volume of money into categories, accounts, investments, and expenses began. That was when I started to see numbers that left me awestruck by the magnitude of the operation. We aren't talking about a small church with a few scattered congregations. Jehovah's Witnesses have more than 8 million active members around the world, and each one is encouraged to donate regularly, even if they are small amounts. When you multiply small donations by millions of people, month after month, year after year, the result is a financial machine of astounding proportions. My routine was meticulous and repetitive, exactly how I liked it. I woke up at 6 in the morning when the bell rang in the Bethel hallways, took a quick shower in the communal bathroom, put on one of the 3 white shirts I owned, and went down for breakfast in the main dining hall, where hundreds of Bethelites gathered before starting their daily assignments. The food was simple but sufficient, prepared by brothers and sisters who worked in the kitchen and who apparently found spiritual joy in peeling potatoes and preparing tons of oatmeal every day. After breakfast, everyone headed to their department. Mine was on the 5th floor of one of the main buildings, a wide room full of desks, old computers that were gradually replaced by modern models, and physical files that occupied entire walls. We worked in silence most of the time, interrupted only by brief conversations about a question on a report or by edifying comments about Bible texts we had considered at the meeting the night before. There was no radio playing, no talk of sports or politics, nothing that could distract from the seriousness of the work we were performing. It was an environment that simultaneously calmed me and suffocated me, but I had learned to interpret that sensation of suffocation as a test of my dedication, as something Satan planted in my mind to make me doubt. For the first 10 years, I never questioned anything. I saw the numbers, I saw the transfers, I saw the investments, but everything seemed to make sense within the narrative they had taught me. Of course, the organization needed to invest money to guarantee its future sustainability. Of course, there were significant administrative expenses to coordinate a global work. Of course, not everything could be transparent because we lived in a hostile world full of enemies who would love to use financial information to attack the organization. I believed this with the same certainty with which I believed the sun would rise the next day. But something began to change gradually after I completed 15 years at Bethel. Perhaps it was age bringing some perspective that youth does not allow. Perhaps it was the accumulated fatigue of living under such strict rules without ever having a moment truly my own, or perhaps it was simply the fact that I spent so much time looking at those numbers that I began to see patterns I wasn't supposed to see. I started noticing small discrepancies, things that could be easily explained as typos or confusion in reports, but which appeared frequently enough to plant a seed of doubt that would grow slowly over the next few years. There were bank accounts listed only by numbers, without institution names, without a description of purpose. There were regular transfers to companies that did not appear in any official registry of the organization, amounts ranging between $50,000 and $500,000, going out every month as a fixed expense that no one ever mentioned in the accounts reports to the congregation elders. There were investments in stocks of companies that produced armaments, tobacco, and alcohol, exactly the same industries the organization publicly condemned as part of Satan's system of things that would be destroyed at Armageddon. I didn't speak about this to anyone at first. Who could I question without seeming like an apostate, without looking like someone whose faith was wavering and who was being influenced by critical thoughts planted by the devil? I learned throughout those years that questioning the organization was equivalent to questioning Jehovah, that doubting the decisions of the governing body was doubting the direction of the Holy Spirit, and that expressing these doubts out loud could result in being disfellowshipped and losing contact with every friend I had made over 3 decades. So, I kept my observations to myself, noting them discreetly in notebooks I hid at the back of my drawer, creating a mental file of inconsistencies that grew with each passing month. What kept me trapped wasn't just the fear of losing my community, although that was significant. It was also the fear of discovering that I had wasted the best years of my life serving a lie, that all the sacrifices I made, all the opportunities one refused, all the relationships I abandoned had been in vain. It is hard to explain to an outsider how the mind of someone deeply involved in an organization like this works. It isn't stupidity, it isn't mental weakness. It is a complete belief system built carefully over years, brick by brick, until it forms a structure so solid that questioning it feels equivalent to questioning reality itself. Everything changed definitively when the organization decided to sell the Brooklyn buildings and move the world headquarters to Warwick, in upstate New York. They announced this as a strategic decision guided by Jehovah, a way to simplify operations and better use available resources, but those of us working in accounting knew the real reason was the astronomical value those Brooklyn buildings held in the real estate market. We are talking about properties in one of the most high-value areas of New York, land acquired decades ago for negligible amounts that was now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The sale began gradually starting in 2004, with various buildings being put on the market and sold to real estate developers for amounts that made my head spin. One complex was sold for over $375 million, another for $180 million, and there were at least a dozen other properties being negotiated simultaneously. In total, the organization raised over $1 billion from these sales, a number so absurd I had difficulty processing it mentally even after seeing it written in official reports. I was transferred to Warwick in 2016, along with hundreds of other Bethelites, and the new headquarters was impressive in a completely different way. It was no longer that cramped urban complex in Brooklyn, but a massive campus surrounded by nature, with modern glass and concrete buildings that looked more like a corporate resort than the headquarters of a religious organization. There were artificial lakes, walking trails, meticulously manicured gardens, and facilities that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Everything was justified as necessary for the work, as an investment to ensure the organization could continue functioning efficiently for decades. But it was in Warwick that I gained access to files that were previously restricted to only the highest levels of administration. It wasn't intentional, I wasn't suddenly promoted to a position of extreme trust. It was simply a glitch in the digital permissions system during the chaotic transition between the two headquarters. Someone configured my access incorrectly, and for nearly 8 months before they noticed the error, I had full access to accounts and reports I should never have seen. It was during this period that I discovered the true extent of what was happening with the donation money. There was a complex network of subsidiary companies, some registered in the United States, others in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, all connected in some way to the organization but without obvious identification in public documents. These companies made investments in commercial real estate, in stocks of major corporations, in hedge funds managing billions of dollars. I saw transfers of $50 million being moved to a company in Delaware that existed only on paper, with no employees, no physical office, apparently created solely to hide the true destination of that money. I also discovered there was a special fund, never mentioned in any official publication, designated to pay out-of-court settlements in cases of sexual abuse involving minors within the congregations. These weren't a few isolated cases as the organization always publicly claimed. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of cases around the world, each silenced with agreements that included strict confidentiality clauses and amounts ranging from $50,000 to several $1 million, depending on the severity and the persistence of the victims and their lawyers. This fund was fed regularly with transfers coming from general donation accounts, which meant that money sent by sincere brothers to support the preaching work was being used to silence abuse victims and protect the organization's reputation. I saw a specific case in Australia where they paid almost $2 million to a victim in exchange for their silence, and another in California where the amount reached $3 million because the victim had documentary evidence that could destroy the credibility of several influential elders. What shocked me wasn't just the existence of these payments, but the bureaucratic coldness with which they were processed. They were treated like any other operating expense, with standardized forms, specific category codes, approvals signed by members of the legal department and the service department. There was no apparent moral anguish, no discussions on how to prevent future abuse or punish the perpetrators. It was simply a financial problem to be solved as efficiently as possible, minimizing long-term costs and avoiding negative publicity. I began making discrete copies of documents, saving files onto flash drives I hid in different places, creating backups of backups because I knew if anyone discovered what I was doing, I wouldn't just be kicked out of Bethel but likely sued for breach of confidentiality and who knows what other accusations they would invent to silence me. I worked late at night when most other Bethelites had already returned to their rooms, using the excuse of being behind on monthly reports to justify my solitary presence in the office. Every document I copied weighed on my conscience in different ways. Part of me still wanted to believe there were reasonable explanations, that I was misinterpreting things because I lacked the full context, that more mature and wise brothers would understand perfectly what I saw as irregularities. But another part of me, the part that grew with each new document discovered, knew there was no way to justify what I was seeing, that no amount of additional context would transform these actions into something acceptable in the eyes of God or any reasonable ethical standard. The final breaking point came when I discovered regular transfers being made to the personal accounts of members of the governing body, amounts described as expense reimbursements but occurring so frequently and in such significant sums that it was impossible to justify them as legitimate expenses. We are talking about $20, $30, sometimes $50,000 a month going to individuals who had supposedly taken a vow of poverty, who supposedly depended completely on the organization for their basic needs and lived simple lives of spiritual dedication. Leaving Bethel was the hardest decision I have ever made in my entire life, harder even than my divorce decades ago, harder than any professional choice I faced before becoming a Jehovah's Witness. It wasn't a sudden decision made in a moment of anger or acute disappointment. It was a slow awakening process that took months, perhaps years if counting from the first seeds of doubt to the moment I finally admitted to myself that I could no longer continue being part of it. First, I had to deal with the cognitive dissonance that threatened to split me in two. During the day, I continued executing my duties normally, processing financial reports, checking numbers, participating in morning meetings where we discussed Bible texts and received spiritual encouragement from the superintendents. At night, alone in my room after my roommates slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what I knew with what I had believed for 30 years. It is like discovering that your parents, whom you always admired as examples of integrity, were actually criminals who simply hid their crimes well during your entire childhood. I tried to rationalize it in every possible way. I told myself that human organizations are imperfect, that even serving Jehovah we are still subject to mistakes, that perhaps those financial irregularities were aberrations caused by corrupt individuals and not systemic policies of the organization. But the more I investigated, the more I realized they were not isolated cases. It was a consistent pattern, a structure deliberately built to accumulate wealth while keeping the common members in ignorance, encouraging them to donate more while hiding how that money was actually used. The process of voluntary disassociation is brutal in ways outsiders will never fully understand. It isn't simply leaving a church and finding another, or deciding religion isn't for you and moving on with your life. When you are a Jehovah's Witness, especially after decades of deep involvement, the organization becomes your entire identity, your entire social network, your worldview, and your purpose for existence. Leaving means losing all of that simultaneously, It means instantly becoming invisible to people you considered family. It means having to rebuild a life from scratch at 57 years old. I announced my intention to leave Bethel in a conversation with one of the overseers, a man named Victor Brennan whom I had known for over 20 years and who had always been kind to me. I didn't mention the documents I had copied. I didn't accuse anyone of corruption or hypocrisy. I simply said I was having doubts about my faith and needed time away to reflect and rebuild my spirituality. Victor looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and suspicion, as if I were a wound that needed to be cauterized before it infected others. I had 2 weeks to pack my things and leave the complex. 2 weeks to end a life of 3 decades, to say goodbye to people who quickly began to avoid me as the news spread, to pack the few possessions I had accumulated and try to imagine what it would be like to restart from zero without a job, without a home, without a support network. The organization offers no pension or severance for Bethelites who leave, no matter how many years you served. You simply leave with what you can carry and must figure out how to survive in the world you spent decades learning to view as Satan's territory. I moved into a tiny apartment in Patterson, a small town near Warwick, using the savings I had kept over the years and which, thankfully, I had never completely donated. I found work as a freelance accountant for small local businesses, using skills that were rusty after so long doing only religious accounting but were still sufficient to pay for rent and food. I lived the first few months in a kind of existential fog, waking up every day not knowing who I was or what my purpose was now that I no longer had the organization defining every aspect of my life. The loneliness was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the physical absence of people around, because I was always someone comfortable with solitude. It was the absence of shared purpose, of absolute certainty about the meaning of life and the universe, of a clear narrative about past, present, and future. Suddenly I was just another man of nearly 60 living in a cheap apartment and working an unimportant job, without the promise of an earthly paradise, without the hope of reuniting with dead loved ones, without the conviction of being part of the most important work ever accomplished in human history. I tried to contact my ex-wife, whom I hadn't seen in over 30 years, but I discovered she had remarried and built a completely different life in Florida. I sent a letter explaining I had left the organization and apologizing for the years I wasted on a pursuit I now recognized as an illusion, but I never received a reply. Probably she had simply moved on decades ago and saw no reason to reopen that chapter of her life. It was during this period of isolation and rebuilding that I decided what to do with the documents I had copied. I couldn't simply keep them in a drawer and pretend they didn't exist, not after everything I went through to obtain them. But I was also afraid of the consequences of making them public. I knew the organization had powerful legal departments and practically unlimited resources to sue anyone they considered a threat. I sought out lawyers specializing in cases against religious organizations, investigative journalists who had written about Jehovah's Witnesses, and support groups for ex-members who might know how to proceed. What I discovered was an entire world of people who had gone through similar experiences, who had left the organization for different reasons but shared the same type of trauma and disorientation I was feeling. There were abuse victims who never received justice, there were people disfellowshipped for questioning doctrines or for simply failing to follow impossible rules, there were elders who had seen things that destroyed their faith but took years to find the courage to leave. Every story I heard validated my decision to leave and reinforced my determination to expose what I had discovered. Finally, after months of careful preparation, I decided to share the documents with journalists from major media outlets, providing evidence they could verify independently and use in investigative reports. I did this anonymously at first, through intermediaries and using encryption to protect my identity, but I knew eventually I would be discovered, that the organization would investigate until they traced the source of the leak to me. I was prepared to face the consequences, be it a lawsuit, intimidation, or any other form of retaliation they decided to use. The first reports started appearing 6 months after I provided the documents, investigative pieces published in major newspapers detailing the secret financial empire of Jehovah's Witnesses and how billions of dollars in donations were managed in ways that completely contradicted the image of simplicity and transparency the organization projected publicly. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The organization issued statements denying the allegations, calling the reports apostate lies, warning members not to read or believe anything published by the satanic media that was under Satan's control and wanted to destroy God's people. But there was something different this time. The documents were real, verifiable, impossible to simply dismiss as fabrications of enemies. Other journalists began their own investigations. Tax authorities in various countries started asking questions about potential violations of non-profit laws. Abuse victims who had been silenced with financial settlements started speaking publicly now that they knew they weren't alone. It was like seeing a dam developing small cracks that gradually expanded until the entire structure threatened to collapse. I received a letter from the organization's lawyers demanding I stop speaking about confidential matters and threatening to sue for breach of confidentiality agreements I apparently signed when I started working at Bethel decades ago. I responded through my own lawyer, someone working pro bono for victims of religious abuse, arguing that confidentiality agreements cannot legally be used to cover up crimes or fraudulent activities and that my right to report irregularities was protected by whistleblower laws. The lawsuit never moved forward, likely because they realized a public trial would bring even more unwanted attention to the documents I had leaked. The impact on the Jehovah's Witness community was complex and varied. Most members simply ignored the reports, obediently following the organization's instructions not to consume apostate media, trusting that it was all just persecution prophesied in the scriptures as a sign we were living in the last days. But a significant minority began to have doubts, began asking inconvenient questions in congregations, began searching online and discovering they weren't the only ones with concerns about how the organization operated. I saw statistics showing a significant increase in the number of people leaving the religion in the years following the reports, although the organization continued reporting global growth because new converts in developing countries partially compensated for losses in more developed Western countries where people had greater access to information. I received hundreds of messages from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and from people still inside the organization but starting to wake up, thanking me for having the courage to expose what I discovered, sharing their own stories of abuse, manipulation, and disillusionment that resonated painfully with my experience. One of the messages that impacted me most came from a woman named Lydia Kovacs, a 63-year-old sister who had served as a missionary in Central America for almost 40 years and who was now dying of cancer in a hospital in Honduras without adequate resources because the organization had sent her back home when she became too sick to continue missionary service. She wrote saying she had dedicated her entire life waiting to live in the earthly paradise, that she had sacrificed marriage and children and any kind of financial security, and that now she realized she was dying alone and poor while the men who ran the organization lived comfortably, surrounded by luxury paid for with donations from people like her. Stories like Lydia's kept me awake at night, making me question if I should have spoken sooner, if I could have saved more people from wasting their entire lives serving an organization that viewed them only as resources to be exploited. But I also knew that if I had tried to expose everything years earlier, when my doubts were merely suspicions without concrete evidence, I would have been easily dismissed as a bitter apostate and no one would have taken my accusations seriously. The time I spent collecting documentation was necessary, however painful it is to think of how many people suffered during those years while I silently gathered proof. The organization responded to the controversies in the only way it knew how, doubling down on its rhetoric against apostates and intensifying control over members through increasingly explicit warnings about the dangers of consuming information from external sources. They published articles in their official magazines warning about how Satan used the internet and social media to plant doubts in the minds of Jehovah's servants, how it was crucial to avoid any contact with ex-members who were described as mentally ill and dangerous. Congregations were instructed to identify members who demonstrated any sign of doubt and report them immediately to the elders for intervention before they could contaminate others. Simultaneously, there were subtle changes in how the organization presented its finances, making some aspects superficially more transparent while burying the most questionable operations even deeper in complex corporate structures. They began publishing summarized financial reports showing general numbers for donations and expenses, but without detailing investments, subsidiaries, or the special funds designated for legal settlements. It was transparency theater, designed to calm worried members without actually changing anything substantial about how the money was managed. My life gradually found a strange new balance. I continued working as an accountant, slowly expanding my client base and building a reputation as a reliable professional in the local community. I made friends with people who had no connection whatsoever to Jehovah's Witnesses, relationships based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than religious obligation. I learned to appreciate small pleasures that had been forbidden or discouraged during my life as a witness, simple things like watching movies without worrying if they contained improper content, reading books on philosophy and science without filtering everything through biblical lenses, having honest conversations about doubts and uncertainties without fear of being judged as spiritually weak. But I also carried scars I knew would never completely disappear. I had recurring nightmares where I was back at Bethel, trapped in endless meetings, suffocating under the weight of rules controlling every aspect of life. I would wake up in panic, taking a few seconds to remember I was free, that no one could tell me how to live, what to think, or who to speak to anymore. Freedom was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying for someone who spent 3 decades having every important decision made by an external authority. I became involved with support groups for ex-members of high-control religions, sharing my story at conferences and workshops, helping other people navigate the traumatic process of leaving and rebuilding identity from scratch. I discovered there were universal patterns in how these organizations operated, whether they were Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Scientology, or any of the hundreds of other groups using similar techniques of mind control and financial exploitation. The playbook was always the same: convince vulnerable people they have exclusive truth, isolate them from outside influences, load them with guilt and fear, and extract financial resources and free labor while leaders lived comfortably. I received invitations to testify at government hearings regarding the regulation of religious organizations, contributing my experience and documentation to help legislators understand how these organizations abused tax-exempt status while operating essentially as profitable multinational corporations. It was gratifying to feel that my knowledge and sacrifice served a greater purpose, that perhaps I could help protect future generations from going through what I went through. There were moments of doubt where I asked myself if I had done the right thing, if perhaps I should have simply kept quiet and continued living my life quietly at Bethel until retirement or death. The temptation to believe I had exaggerated the irregularities, that perhaps I had misinterpreted complex documents, was strong, especially in moments of loneliness when I missed the absolute certainty and sense of community the religion provided. But then I would receive another message from someone whose life had been destroyed by the organization, or read another report about systematic abuse being covered up, and I remembered why I had done what I did. The truth is, there is no simple happy ending for stories like mine. I didn't wake up one day suddenly healed of all psychological scars. I didn't reunite with lost family and live happily ever after. I didn't see the organization collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Life is more complicated and less narratively satisfying than we would like. But I found something that perhaps is more valuable than easy happiness. I found authenticity. I found the ability to live according to my own values rather than values imposed by others. I found peace in uncertainty instead of false certainty purchased at the price of my integrity. Today, at 59 years old, I look back and see a life divided into 2 almost incompatible halves, as if lived by completely different people. The first half was dedicated to a cause I believed to be divine, sacrificing everything society considers important: family, career, financial security, personal independence, all in exchange for the promise of eternal life in an earthly paradise and the privilege of serving the true God. The second half, still in its early stages, is dedicated to rebuilding a life based on reality instead of fantasy, on genuine human connections instead of conditional love tied to doctrinal conformity, in pursuit of truth even when painful, instead of blind acceptance of easy answers. If I could go back in time and speak to my 25-year-old self, that lost and vulnerable young man who accepted the first warm embrace offered by strangers in suits carrying Bibles, I don't know exactly what I would say. Part of me wants to believe I would warn him, that I would save him from 3 decades of wasted life. But another part recognizes that young man desperately needed something to believe in, needed community and purpose, and perhaps wasn't ready to hear warnings about the dangers hidden beneath that welcoming surface. Perhaps some lessons can only be learned through lived experience, no matter how painful. What I can do now is share this story with whoever is willing to listen, not out of vengeance or bitterness, but because I believe transparency and truth are antidotes to manipulation and abuse. Religious organizations, just like any other human institution, must be held accountable for their actions, especially when they claim moral authority and demand extraordinary sacrifices from their followers. The money donated by sincere people, often poor people who can barely pay their own bills but send $5 or $10 monthly because they believe they are supporting a divine work, deserves to be used with absolute integrity and total transparency. When I discover that this money is being invested in stocks of tobacco companies while members are disfellowshipped for smoking, when I see millions being used to silence abuse victims instead of protecting children, when I find evidence that religious leaders live comfortably at the expense of others' sacrifices, I cannot remain silent, even if that silence would be safer and more comfortable for me. This story does not end here because the work of exposure and reform is far from complete. There are still millions of people trapped in high-control organizations around the world. There are still children being abused and silenced. There are still billions of dollars being moved in secret while honest donors believe they are funding humanitarian and spiritual work. Every person who hears this story and decides to investigate for themselves, every ex-member who finds the courage to speak about their experience, every journalist who dedicates time to seriously investigate these organizations instead of simply repeating their official narratives, is part of a larger movement toward accountability and justice. My hope is that by sharing what I discovered during 3 decades inside the system, I can help other people make informed choices about where they place their faith, their time, their money, and their loyalty, and that those already trapped can find the strength to question, to investigate, and eventually to break free if they so choose.